Public life in the decade after the war now seems to have been curiously muted. Habits of obedience persisted, and demonstrations and marches, everyday events in the 60s, were unknown in the bland, forgettable decade that stretched between VJ Day and the Suez Adventure. If political life was tame and obedient for those 10 years, the theatre was conformist also. Incessant revivals interspersed with Eliot's somewhat rarefied later verse plays and the plays of Ennui, dealing with such comfortable themes as the pathos of lost innocence, made writers feel that the theatre would not welcome them. All this changed in 1956 with the production of Look Back in Anger. For the first time, the voice of someone not born to keep his upper lip stiff and take it with Britain could be heard raised in violent soliloquy of discontent. None of us who lived through that time can fail to be grateful to John Osborne, and my own childhood fantasies of performing and showing off on the dining room staircase, the theatrical dreams which made me shut myself away in the bedroom making sets for a model theatre, might have remained a well-guarded secret but for the change his success brought about. My own entrance into the theatre was on a smaller, not to say a minute, scale. I had once gone, on the instructions of the Free Legal Advice Centre, to London Sessions to defend an elderly man on a charge of receiving stolen fish. For many years it remained my only criminal trial. London Sessions is stuck in a sort of urban desert without a reasonable pub to go to in the lunch hour. While a hint of sunshine often touches the gilded figure of justice on the dome of the Old Bailey, it always seems to be raining round London Sessions. It was in that court, as I defended the fish receiver, that I saw a row of old barristers waiting for the dock brief. Unwanted criminal practitioners had an option not open to their unemployed learned friends in the probate, divorce and admiralty division. In those days, before legal aid, penurious, unrepresented criminals could pick out any robed figure in court to defend them. There'd be a quick consultation in the cells, and then the trial, for which the winning barrister received, I think, a guinea. Busy barristers, men with cases elsewhere and a diary full of engagements, would duck out of court bent double when a dock brief was about to be chosen. Those who were less in demand would sit on, preening themselves like a line of elderly wigged wallflowers, in the hope of being selected by the all-powerful figure in the dock. Of course, it was quite contrary to legal etiquette to wink, wave, or try and attract the attention in any way of the alleged criminal upon whom so much depended. The dock brief had to be, like so much in the law, a matter of pure chance. I invented one such unsuccessful barrister for a radio play and paired him with an equally unsuccessful criminal. I wanted to say something about the lawyer's almost pathetic dependence on the criminal classes, without whom he'd be unemployed. And I wanted to find a criminal who'd be sorrier for his luckless advocate than he was for himself. Whether it was the new freedom of writing for actors whose voices would come out of the air unattached to a realistic set, I don't know, but I found myself working with ease at a new level of reality, one that was approximately 2 feet above the ground. It was a style which had come naturally to me when I wrote my first novel, which had become lost in the pursuit of more literal models. Since then I have not aimed to write dialogue which is entirely realistic, although I have always believed that comedy writing, like comic acting, must be based on some recognizable truth. If this is so, then it's possible to take off and break the sound barrier of pure naturalism. Radio plays have many advantages. They are not subject to the technical mischances and distractions of the theatre and television. They call on the audience to make a great effort of imagination, and in them words must be used, as they were in the Elizabethan theatre, to paint scenery or suggest changes of light. They also appear in decent obscurity. Last night's radio play is hardly ever front-page news, and I never had to fear "Mortimer lays egg on third programme" as a headline in the Daily Express. Where the doc brief was noticed, however, it seemed to be liked, and the BBC paid me an extra £20 for it, a gesture of goodwill which I was told was almost unknown in the history of the corporation. My father said, "When you first read that play to us, I thought it was poor fooling, likely to come very tardy off. But much to our surprise, when we listened to the wireless, it really came across quite well." Michael Codron had just come down from Oxford and decided, as an alternative to his father's cement works, to go into theatrical management, where he became the greatest patron and promoter of new writers and now enjoys great commercial success. His then partner, David Hall, had written to me, and when I called on Mr. Codron, he appeared to be rather young and very silent. In the years to come, I discovered that this silence was an effective technique for conducting interviews. If you can keep quiet for long enough, your interviewee is bound to make some rash promise, if only to save the occasion from becoming boring. In this way, patients apparently blurt out bitter self-truths to avoid boring the analyst who sits couch-side and silent. In my case, the commitment was to write a companion piece to the doc brief, which Mr. Codron wished to stage at the Lyric Hammersmith in the course of a season which was to include the first production of Harold Pinter's play, The Birthday Party. If I failed to produce a second play in about 2 months, Mr. Codron threatened to do the doc brief with something he called an Ionesco, a word I thought in my appalling ignorance denoted an educational branch of the United Nations. Ignorant of the terrors of playwriting and its technical difficulties, I wrote a companion play called What Shall We Tell Caroline surprisingly quickly. At the time the doc brief opened, Penelope and I rented the nursery wing of an enormous manor house in Norfolk, to which we would go for long weekends and family holidays. The climate there was what they call bracing, that is to say, it was a few degrees up on that in which Captain Oates took his final and heroic departure. There were big empty beaches and cliffs which the children slid down in an avalanche of sand, and with rare courage they sometimes swam in the treacherous waters of the North Sea. Then we would build bonfires of driftwood on the shore to cook shrimps and sausages and still their chattering teeth. I sat on days of pale sunshine in the garden and wrote with a pen forced between freezing fingers. The importance of failure and critical attack is that it may rob a writer of confidence. It's like riding a bicycle and being told you can't do it. If you listen to this verdict, you immediately fall off. The small success of the doc brief had given new confidence to the voice I had found. New stories came to me easily and almost uninvited. I wrote quickly and with great happiness. In another part of the garden, wearing gumboots and a fisherman's sweater, Penelope typed without interruption, charting the sea of marriage and its hidden rocks and shallows. The children played happily in the house, losing themselves in the long corridors and dust-sheeted drawing rooms of the part of the manor we didn't inhabit. I had enjoyed, up to then, writing short plays for the theatre and for television. So, with a good deal of trepidation, I began a full-length play. The central character was our house in Swiss Cottage, and I called the play The Wrong Side of the Park. The play, at the time, appeared to be a success. In a way, that time marked the beginning of the end of our living in the Swiss Cottage house, because although we stayed on for a number of years, we had begun, perhaps unconsciously, to make secret preparations for our departure. It was the last play of mine that my father saw. In the last years of his life, my father's garden became mutinous. He depended on a changing stream of gardeners and garden boys whose attendance was sporadic. In their absence, the weeds took over more and more territory, and a large part of the fruit cage collapsed. He went less and less often to his chambers, and occasionally, in a strange reversal of our roles, he did the paperwork and drafted the legal pleadings, which I had no time to do. His diaries speak of the number of people who worked at the house. There was Dora, a fat cook who came by bicycle from a nearby village. She was walking out with a man to whom she had been engaged for some 30 years, and she was waiting for his younger brother to die before she felt they could marry. Dora helped my father fill in his football coupons. The pool seemed to have occurred to him as a source of income in his 70s, when the chance of a good money brief grew slimmer. Otherwise, the diary records his frustrations as he waited for Gerald or Thomas or Alan or Mr. Long or Mr. Richards to call and do battle against the weeds. Gerald's name appears the most often. Gerald's visits were unpredictable, and when he came he often spent hours fiddling with the lawnmower, and no grass was cut. Ever anxious about the world and hungry for literature, my father persuaded my mother to read him Harold Pinter's The Caretaker, and to her intense embarrassment, Lolita. In the year we did The Wrong Side of the Park, he had a heart attack. The doctor came in the middle of the night and gave him 2 injections of morphia, and later sent a male nurse called Hare, a somewhat sinister figure who didn't expect my father to live. After a while my father banished Hare from his bedroom, so the sullen nurse sat in the kitchen chain-smoking and telling me how long it would be before the end. I think it was mainly to irritate Hare that my father made a determined recovery and ordered a kidney for his breakfast. Later, the diary records with great satisfaction that Gerald came to work and that Hare was driven to the station in Henley. This ill-tempered harbinger of death was not seen in the house again. For a long time my father's recovery seemed complete. In the July of his last year, my father had raspberry pie from his own raspberries, and the peas were demolished by jays. Gerald was kept busy, tidying up by the white seat and round the camellias. Someone called Bartholomew was weeding on the terrace and in front of the borders. And then, at long last, and after much fiddling with the mower, Gerald cut the grass and was paid. August was cold and miserable. My mother read Waiting for Godot aloud, and they wasted time trying to extricate a peach net from the loft and discovered that Gerald had been paid twice for 1 lot of grass cutting. By the end of the month my father was eating his own tomatoes. Suddenly the weather changed and became hot and stifling. It took 4 men and 2 Allen scythes to cut the long grass in the west field. Towards the end of September my father was troubled with a pain in his left wrist, which the doctor diagnosed as gout, an affliction he suffered from whenever he ate strawberries. 2 or 3 days later he became very ill, and I went to stay in the house. My mother had been left with oxygen cylinders and a mask, which she was to put on my father's face to help him breathe. The night was very hot when he died. The doctor called and said there was nothing more he could do, but that we should try and keep my father awake. The huge and unwieldy garden surrounding the small house seemed unnaturally silent, and I could hear nothing but the sound of my father's assisted breathing. At the last moment he wanted to get out of bed and cried out angrily because we wouldn't let him have a bath. When my mother protested, he said, "I'm always angry when I'm dying." I don't know if it was something he had prepared for a long time, but those were the last words I heard him say. I held the mask over his face until he no longer had need of it. After my father died, I slept for 2 days without interruption. I wrote at the end of a play, "I'd been told of all the things you're meant to feel. Sudden freedom, growing up, the end of dependence, the step into the sunlight when no one is taller than you and you're in no one's shadow." I know what I felt. Lonely. Of all the clients in criminal cases, I came to find those accused of murder the easiest to deal with. Murder is not only the most serious crime, but it's often the most understandable. Murder happens, in many cases, in the family. It's a sort of crime that might be committed by ordinary and even decent people who would be quite incapable of taking part in a bank raid or robbing the co-op. Contrary to the beliefs of all the great crime writers, murder is hardly ever planned. It almost never involves the search for ingenious methods of killing or the elaborate construction of false clues. Murder is what happens at the single moment when the long stifled domestic row, the feeling of rivalry and hatred in the pub, or the pang of jealousy and rage in the disco, slither out of control and skid towards an irreversible tragedy. So many scenes between husbands and wives, parents and children, between all people who are passionately involved with each other, contain the seeds of potential murder. Murder trials aren't usually about whodunit, almost always about whether they meant it. What did the accused intend? Was he or she making some kind of a demonstration which ended in the most unlooked-for consequences, with someone once loved, naked on a slab being photographed after the post-mortem, with the testing of blood-stains and stomach contents and pubic hair, and endless questions designed to illuminate that moment which some merciful mental process may have forever obliterated? I never had the experience of defending in a murder trial in the days of the death penalty. I don't know if I could have done so, or if I could have tolerated a contest where one question too many, one wrong decision about the admissibility of evidence, might bring about your client's death. Those accused of murder have usually, even if they didn't intend it, killed. This act seems in a curious way to have drained them of violence. In all but the most rare cases, they have killed the one person they're ever likely to kill and are no longer dangerous. Sometimes they speak of what they have done in strange and unforgettable words. I remember one young man who'd killed his mother starting his statement with, "I have either raped a prostitute or killed a peacock in paradise." The advocate goes to Brixton Prison, crosses the compound where the Alsatian dogs and the trustees eye each other suspiciously. He's shown into the blue-painted, relatively cheerful interview block. The man who comes to him in the little glass-walled room, who takes a cigarette gratefully from his solicitor's clerk and laughs obediently at his nervous jokes, must live with the fact that he caused a death. The advocate explains the trial to his client, asks him how many of the police statements he challenges, and leaves after shaking the hand that killed. The idea that if the advocate doesn't succeed on the question of what was intended in an isolated moment of emotion, his client will be taken out and ceremonially slaughtered by some part-time pubkeeper in a dark suit seems monstrous and unreal. A judicial killing is always premeditated, and so perhaps more shameful than the crime itself. Ruth Ellis shot her boyfriend outside the Magdala pub in Hampstead in the mid-50s, and I can't say that I felt personally stained or humiliated by the tragedy, nor I'm sure did the public feel so outraged that they could only be satisfied by the blood of that distracted and neurotic girl. However, when Ruth Ellis was hanged, I remember hiding the newspapers from the children, ashamed of what was being done, so it was said, on our behalf. When one Home Secretary, I think it was Reggie Maudling, toyed with the idea of a death penalty, an intelligent civil servant said, "Well, where would you get the hangman? Would you advertise in the Times?" Hanging is the act of brutality which we commit with the help of some ghastly surrogate. Years ago I remember seeing one husband in a divorce case who was accused of a series of cruel sexual perversions. It was also suggested that he had some secret and undivulged source of income, which he was keeping from his wife. When asked about this, he said that the answer was an official secret. Pressed further, he admitted that he was a part-time assistant hangman. Against all rules of legal etiquette, I turned him away and refused to concern myself in his case. It is on such people that those who support the death penalty must depend. I've said that most murders are spontaneous and not the result of long-term planning. An exception to this rule was the case of my best friend at Oxford, the support and inspiration of the pacifist service unit, Dr. Henry Winter. Continuing my journey backward, I had reached some sort of plateau of adolescence. I had taken a flat in Maida Vale when separated from my wife. I became for a while emotionally attached to the telephone. I was in that exhausting state when every evening has to be planned and the tangled skeins of living kept separate. The crimes I was involved in, the murders I did, were perfectly clear to me. My own life seemed confused and chaotic. I remember getting up in my flat around dawn and thirstily filling the bathroom tumbler. Too late I discovered I had drunk a pair of mink eyelashes. It was, I suppose, a time of life everyone passes through, although for me it had been postponed because of the pressure of family life. The children had reacted to our parting with an unexpected calm and lack of surprise. Their lives had started at that grown-up level which I had momentarily abandoned. There's much about that period I remember with great pleasure, including a girl who worked in a tropical fish shop. She used to drive me to work in her firm's van, and I would sit in the front as we crossed the parks with huge tanks full of angelfish sloshing in the back. I remembered the vanished places to dance, the Arethusa, and the Ad Lib Club high over Leicester Square, and Annie's Room. The tunes of the period of Help and Love Me Do, which seem so much more remote than the time of Bluebirds Over the White Cliffs of Dover or You Are My Sunshine, float back into my mind. There's nothing about that time which I particularly regret. It's only important that I should describe accurately how things were when Henry Winter came to see me again after a long time. My links with the past were growing frail. Oliver Pensotti had vanished, having long ago left the country. I had a postcard from him from Portugal and a pair of cufflinks from Rio, but these communications kept his address a secret, and after that I heard no more. My friends seemed to be the actors or directors I worked with. We became involved during a production, saw a lot of each other, and then slowly drifted apart. I had begun to write some radio pieces about my childhood. My mother disliked my doing this. Like her father's suicide and her husband's blindness, she felt, understandably, that there were private matters which should not be generally discussed. I went to the country to see her often, but there was always something held back between us, a sort of reserve which didn't melt for a long time. It was as though she was still occupied in caring for my father. We sat together in the garden, but she was suspicious that I would want to break in on her continued solitary pursuit of their joint way of life. My children, who were not going to write anything, met her without inhibition. They often went to stay with her, rescued my old books and model theatre from the attic, and seemed grateful that life in my father's house was proceeding as usual. His death, like his blindness, was largely ignored. At that time I felt conscious of the lack of a guiding light. There seemed to be no one whose instincts were infallibly right, or to whom I could turn at moments of personal or artistic confusion. When I was assailed by these thoughts, I remembered Henry Winter, imperturbably pursuing the good life as a doctor in the West Country. I must, I told myself, see Winter soon, but the meeting was, for one reason or another, constantly postponed. Late one wet afternoon, some theatrical occasion, a read-through perhaps, or part of a rehearsal, was going on in my flat. Actors and actresses were drinking white wine and talking only of the news in their world, which is in its way as small and protected as the world of lawyers. There was a ring at the bell, and when I opened the front door I discovered Henry Winter, standing in the rain, a sort of plastic mac over his tweed jacket, and he was smiling with his habitual look of modesty and withdrawn wisdom. I felt, as I usually did when I saw him in those days, somehow guilty and corrupt. I got rid of the actors and actresses as quickly as possible. In their presence Winter sat smiling but silent, and I felt that his calm and useful existence compared favourably to the empty excitement of putting on any sort of show. It was not long before we were alone, and I said, "I'm sorry about those people. I'm afraid they're rather boring." "Are you?" "I found them interesting enough. But I wanted to ask your advice." My advice? What could I tell Winter, who had surely found in the village where he practiced the still centre of understanding? Yes, he said, and astonished me with, I want to know how much I'd have to pay my wife after a divorce. Then he told me the story. It seemed that Winter had fallen hopelessly and obsessively in love with a woman who cleaned at the local hospital. She wasn't young. In fact, she was a middle-aged woman with a number of children, and she lived with her husband in the council houses on the outskirts of the village. The husband was Winter's patient, and the good doctor prescribed sleeping pills, which would keep the man drugged while his wife silently left the house and made her way through the sleeping village to the surgery. And there, with Winter's children asleep upstairs, they made love on his medical couch. It's hopeless, was the only sort of lawyer's advice I could give him. You're bound to get found out. Oh, I know that. In fact, I'm quite prepared for it. That's why I want to know how much I'll have to pay my wife after the divorce. It's only the practical things that matter now. Like, I thought, the drugs for the husband and the fact of having a couch in a downstairs room. I told him that he'd probably have to give his wife a third of his income and support his children. Oh, that's all right. We can live on what I'll have left. Annie, that's the woman from the hospital, isn't at all extravagant. She came to the village when she was a child, with the gypsies. Well, they'll strike you off the medical register. It doesn't matter. I'm going to work abroad anyway, probably South America. There'll only be one problem. What's that? Seeing nothing but insoluble difficulties, I was astonished at Winter's calm. That'll be if Annie doesn't want to come with me. I mean, if she wants to stay with her husband. There'll only be one answer then, won't there? I didn't ask him what the answer was. I didn't feel that I could bear to learn more about Winter's troubles. What had happened? How could it be that life in his placid village was more frenzied than any I had heard of in London? And how did it come about that my friend, the man I depended on most for perpetual and untapped wisdom, had moved away into the shadows of his extraordinary drama, and worst of all, came only to see me because I was a lawyer? You know, I said, and poured him a glass of white wine, I used to think you had the secret of the universe. It's extremely unwise, he warned me, to think that anyone has that. Not much later, he put on his plastic pack-a-mac and went out into the rain. What happened then, I only read about in the papers, although some further details were given to me by Henry Winter's wife, who was, with some reason, bitterly angry. I also learnt a lot from his partner, who now knew that for the last 3 months of his life my friend was going on his medical rounds, cheering up the elderly and comforting the children, with a sawn-off shotgun worn in a holster under his jacket. He had asked Annie to leave her family and go with him to South America, but she was never willing to do so. When at last he showed her the passports and the money he had for both of them, she resolutely refused to go. He killed her with a shotgun and then drove into a wood where he swallowed most of the drugs in his medical case. It was some time before they found his body, but when they did so, he was still holding the passports. I think about these things often, but I cannot explain them. I can only suggest that Henry Winter suffered terribly and unusually from having rejected the violence which was made available to us at the age when we went to Oxford during the war. The time had come to do what I had done for so many other people and plan a divorce. I remember a meeting we had, a lunch in the Rose Garden at Regent's Park, to discuss the depressing details, the sorting out of money, the allocation of books and pictures which go with funerals and the formal ending of a marriage. I'd had a minor dental disaster that morning. A cap had come adrift, and I went to have it stuck on again. My dentist at that time had a surgery complete with nurses in white miniskirts, Vivaldi tapes, and a pattern of coloured lights to keep you entertained while in the chair. I emerged from the Son et Lumière with my tooth repaired to keep my open-air luncheon appointment with the wife who had once helped me by typing out my divorce petitions. She came to the rose garden with her dog and put the lead and her packet of cigarettes and her lighter on the table. We sat in the sunshine, and Penelope ordered spare ribs. It was extraordinarily peaceful, as we sat surrounded by a silence which was only emphasized by the distant murmur of traffic. We talked in perfect friendliness and discussed our plans for the future. As we talked, Penelope lifted a spare rib and bit into it. Suddenly, and it was like a frozen frame in a movie, my wife sat, spare rib in hand, immobilized and with a look of horror. And then the film moved on again. She gathered up her dog, her cigarettes, and her lighter, and without a word of explanation she was gone from the park. I sat on at the table, half expecting her to return. I had a feeling of being suspended and lost in time. I might sit there perhaps forever, and that table and that place might be the end of a journey, and I would have to go no further. Or I could walk away from Regent's Park into a new life, and leave the law courts and the rehearsal rooms forever. Thinking all these things, I lifted the half-eaten spare rib from Penelope's plate and bit into it. I felt a slight pull on a gum, and then I realized that something was missing from my mouth. My exotic dentist had been too distracted by the miniskirts or the subliminal Vivaldi to fix the broken section of the cap on properly. Before I had time to consider the full implications of the loss, the waitress said there was a telephone call for me. I went, puzzled, into the shadows of the restaurant, lifted the receiver, and heard from Penelope, who had just reached her house. She said she was sorry she had left so abruptly. I said that I understood perfectly, that it was not an easy thing for anyone to sit at lunch discussing a divorce. It wasn't that exactly, she explained. What had happened was that as she bit into her spare rib, a cap came off her tooth, and she didn't want to go on sitting with a mouthful of gap. Again I understood entirely, and said we'd meet again soon, wouldn't we? I went out into the sunshine, where the plates hadn't yet been cleared away, and there was the spare rib which had captured fragments of dentistry from each of us, and which held them tightly and remorselessly together. At that time I had started on a new branch of the law, which I, in my more elevated moments, called arguments about free speech, but most of the friendly hacks in the robing room called them dirty book cases. An article is criminally obscene, Lord Cockburn decided in his great contribution to the law of literature, if it tends to deprave and corrupt. The phrase was coined in the year 1868. His lordship was faced then with an evangelical Wolverhampton metal broker who had published a disgraceful pamphlet about the alleged methods used by Catholic priests to extract erotic confessions from lady penitents. Lord Cockburn, of course, didn't consider the question of literary merit, and even if the metal broker had written a work to rank with Abelard and Eloise, or the love sonnets of John Donne, that fact wouldn't have saved him from the nick. Concerned at this slight to the world of letters, such well-intentioned MPs as Sir Alan Herbert and Mr. Roy Jenkins promoted the Obscene Publications Act 1959. This measure repeated Lord Cockburn's words as the test. A literary work is obscene, says the statute, if it tends to deprave and corrupt those likely to read it. However, if it is obscene, those who publish it are not to be convicted if its publication can be shown to be for the public good because it has artistic or other merit. The literary conception here enshrined in the tablets of our law is an interesting one. A book is first found to be depraving and corrupting, causing its readers to slaver at the mouth, walk with their knuckles brushing the ground, and show a general tendency to breathe heavily down the telephone or rape the lady traffic wardens. However, the same book may then be found to be so exquisitely well written that its effect is ennobling after all. This is the sort of philosophic and aesthetic conception which is, of course, readily understood by your average Brixton jury. The trial of Last Exit to Brooklyn took place about 8 years after the Act was passed. It was the only obscenity case in which witnesses were produced who said that they had been depraved and corrupted, or in which we were given an opportunity of seeing what a depraved and corrupted person looked like. Sir Basil Blackwell, the Oxford bookseller, said that he had certainly been depraved by the book, but as he was in his 80s at the time, the matter didn't seem to be of great practical significance. The Reverend David Shepherd, who had been captain of the English cricket team, also gave evidence to the effect that he had not, metaphorically speaking, held his bat so straight after reading Last Exit to Brooklyn. But as he went on to become Bishop of Liverpool, the damage, whatever it was, doesn't seem to have been serious. In spite of the industry of a number of literary and clerical witnesses, the book was found to be obscene in its trial at the Old Bailey, and the publishers were fined £100. So it came about that the publisher, John Calder, asked me to argue the Last Exit case in the Court of Appeal. I found myself standing up at a point where the two great concerns of my life, writing and the law, met and almost failed to recognize each other. Indeed, I was trying to explain to three courteous and distinguished judges the fundamental difference between writers and lawyers, which produces the basic fallacy of all censorship laws. The writer is bound to explore all areas of human experience. The whole of life must be open to his voyage of discovery. He must sail as far as he can, and his only duty is to come back with the truth as he sees it. There can't be no-go areas in the world of art, and the writer who cuts short a line of work for fear of shocking some people or giving offence is untrue to his calling. But lawyers are trained on no-go areas. They are accustomed to find truth concealed behind barriers marked inadmissible evidence. They can't accept that it's a writer's duty to reveal all truths, however unpalatable. I tried my best to explain this to the Court of Appeal in the Last Exit case, and the judges listened with great care and attention. The proposition, which must be elementary to all students of literature, came to their lordships as an apparent surprise. In the end, the court allowed John Calder's appeal and set aside the conviction. And courts are very unclear about the effect of books on readers. Reading is done in a world of the imagination, which has, it would appear, little direct result on the reader's behaviour. I suppose the worst crime is murder, and murder is nowhere written about more freely than in the works of Agatha Christie. If books had the effect claimed for them by the censors, every English country house would have a blood-stained butler in the library, dead with a knife between his shoulder blades. James Bond, Licensed to Kill, is read about and enjoyed by millions of inoffensive people who catch the train to the office every day and have never killed anyone with a karate chop or slept with a Chinese air hostess. It has been said that it's a strange anomaly of the censoring attitude, that murder is against the law, but it's no crime to write about it. Sex is not against the law, but to write about it has often been held a criminal offence. During these cases, I began to find myself in a dangerous situation as an advocate. I came to believe in the truth of what I was saying. I was no longer entirely what my professional duties demanded. The old taxi on the rank waiting for the client to open the door and give his instructions, prepared to drive off in any direction with the disbelief suspended. The attempts of the law to control the written word seemed to me dangerous and likely to put our courts of justice in a somewhat ridiculous light. I suppose that writers should, in a way, feel flattered by the censorship laws. They show a primitive fear and dread at the fearful magic of print. The law, it has always seemed to me, is at its best when it's enforcing practical remedies for specific crimes. It's at its worst when it tries to enforce the morality of one group in society upon another, which may, for quite sincere and logical reasons, refuse to accept it. And the administration of the censorship laws entails dividing a society into the sensible and the idiotic, the strong and the weaker brethren, and we all know, of course, where we belong. Time and again in obscenity cases, judges and barristers say to juries, "Of course, we've all read stuff like this for years and it doesn't affect us." But there are people, members of the jury, whom you may think would be affected. The assumption is that there's always a second-class citizen who, at the glimpse of a doubtful paragraph or dubious magazine, would go uncontrollably mad. The attitude of censorship depends on the assumption that there is a superior type of person qualified to tell the rest of us what it is good for us to read. It's hard to recapture now the feeling of 1971, a year when Richard Neville, a young Australian writer, asked some vaguely liberated children to help him produce a school kids number of his magazine Oz, thereby promoting an obscenity trial which lasted for 6 hot weeks of that summer at the Old Bailey. The front row of the public gallery contained girls whose T-shirts were decorated with a portrait of the inspector in charge of the case. He stared up from his position of power in the well of the court at a repeated view of his own flushed features, strained between the small breasts of teen-aged girls. The adult editors of Oz, Richard Neville, Jim Anderson, and Felix Dennis, wore for their first day in the dock gym slips and long blonde wigs, treating the proceedings with an apparent levity far removed from the respectful stance and deferential silence of the more acceptable prisoners at the bar. Among the witnesses called was the comedian Marty Feldman, and I remember him whispering to me on his way to the witness box, "Great to be working with you at last." What, I now wonder, did everyone think was going on? A children's revolution? The dawn of a new world when long-haired headmasters would chant Bob Dylan songs at assembly, and an adolescent House of Commons would rap away in perfect love, enveloped in a pungent smell like slow-burning Turkish carpets, and war, shamed by a poem of Allen Ginsberg's, would vanish from the face of the earth. The dream, whatever it was, has faded more rapidly than most, and the school kids of the Oz age are no doubt now paying their mortgages and driving their Ford Cortinas with a nodding dog in the back window and holding down tough jobs as chartered accountants. Even the trial became calmer after its dramatic beginning, and the great majesty of the criminal law of England bent itself to a careful consideration of, among other things, Rupert Bear, an animal long beloved for his docility and innocence, who was unusually portrayed in Oz magazine in a state of high sexual excitement. During the frequent lulls in the proceedings, my mind was filled with other anxieties. I had written a play which was about to open. Into it I had collected my memories of my father and written lines for him, so that a man who had filled so much of my life seemed to have left me and become someone for other people to read about and perform. In one way I felt detached from it, but a play is a public exhibition with its own peculiar dangers, another sort of trial. Not for the only time in my life, I felt that the theatrical drama in which I was involved was more real than the Old Bailey and the due process of law. At the end of the 60s, I became, with waning interest, known for appearing in cases which were alleged to be testing the frontiers of tolerance. One evening I was in my flat, minding my own business, when the telephone rang. I was clearly being rung from a call box, as there was a bleep, 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 and then the button was pressed and an unknown, middle-aged female voice rang out. She asked me my name, and I admitted to it. "I say, I hope you're not having food." "No," I reassured her, "I wasn't having food." "I'm on my way home to the country. I'm ringing you from Paddington Station." "Oh, yes." And you see, my children are grown up now, and Frank, well, to put it mildly, Frank's not the most lively companion. Who's Frank? Oh, Frank's my husband, of course, frightfully respectable. She gave what I believe is known as a light laugh. I didn't reply to this, and she asked in a concerned way, I say, you sure you're not having food? Quite sure. I wouldn't want to pester you when you're having food, but what I want to ask is, do you think I ought to join the Permissive Society? Then she was silent as her money ran out. I stood looking at the telephone, picturing a woman loaded with Harrods bags on her way home to Newbury, and I wondered if everything had perhaps gone too far, and the fabric of society, as they say in the House of Lords, was really coming apart at the seams. And then the telephone rang again. There was a bleep, 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 and more money was inserted. I say, are you still there? Yes, I am. Oh, thank goodness for that. I ran out of cash. So I heard. Well, what do you think? Shall I go in for the permissive? I really don't know. But you're the expert. Not at all. I thought I ought to give the permissive a try. Now the children are grown up, you know. It's entirely a matter for you to decide. I mean, it's your life, and you can't advise me. Well, I'm afraid not, or only not to do anything you might regret. I was beginning to feel sorry for Frank. Oh, dear. She sounded disappointed, but she was kind enough to give me an excuse for my uselessness. I suppose that the fact is you're having food. And then she ran out of money again. At a New Year's Eve party, as the 60s rattled to a halt, I met my future wife. When she told her family about our meeting, her mother protested and asked if I were not an older man. When she heard that I was, in fact, only a year older than she, I doubt if my future mother-in-law was greatly reassured. I visited the family in the faint hope of being approved of as a suitor. My future wife's mother was an enthusiastic swimmer who left their Kentish farm every day of the year to plunge into the grey and unwelcoming waters of the English Channel. She'd won the record for staying in longer than anyone else on Boxing Day. It was in a windy April that I made my first visit, and when she told me how the townies stood on the beach and laughed at this grim endurance test, I said that townies, of course, understood nothing of the splendours and delights of year-round bathing. I should have held my tongue. That afternoon I, who hadn't heard English spoken on a beach for many years, was led tiptoeing across the cruel shingle towards a grey, icy, and even more cruel sea. As I groaned and sank into the gritty, marrow-chilling water, I was not only plunging into the future, but swimming back towards a childhood when I stood shivering on the beach near my uncle's house in Sussex, washing myself free, I hoped, in that symbolic and agonizing gesture of the grimy accumulation of the years. After my father died, my mother continued to battle with the weeds and occasional gardeners, to plant flowers in the places my father had planned for them, and record the performance of the flowers he had planted. But one day she walked round the enormous garden, and then came indoors to write in her diary, "I was very lonely and sad, and nothing could quench my regrets." My wife and I took a house in Ravello, near to the Villa Cimbroni with its row of pale statues, on the edge of the precipice between the garden and the sea. It was a big house with marble floors and a four-poster, and a view down to the Mediterranean, where we could see the white steamer off on its regular, punctual journey to Positano. And there my mother, almost 9 years after his death, made her great escape from my father's house and garden. She climbed aboard an aeroplane for the first time in her life and came to stay with us in Italy. I met my mother, who was blinking in the sun and spurning all assistance, at Naples airport. We embraced then as if we had met after a long, long separation, and on that happy, all-forgiving coast the reserve, the sort of wariness with which we had always treated each other, melted away entirely. I couldn't remember why I had thought for so long that my mother was a stranger to me, totally involved in the supreme sacrifice of her life with my father. and in the hot sunshine, in the marble shadows of the house, or out on the terrace among the bougainvillea, drinking cold Caruso wine and looking miles down to the sea, she giggled, made jokes, became a girl again, the large-eyed, shy, but also daring girl she had been when, a school-teacher in South Africa, she galloped bareback on her pony or stood naked in a waterfall. In Italy, my mother climbed down to the beach, took the long day's boat trip to Capri, sat on a chair put for her in the doorway of the grocer's shop as we did our shopping, or tried out, on a grinning Sorrentine butcher, the careful and perfect Italian which she had learnt in Marlow. Each morning we met on the terrace, whilst the others were still asleep, and she was wearing a dressing gown with her long hair down over her shoulders like a young girl. She would smile and say buongiorno, and we would kiss and plan another day of our great new-found friendship, at ease in a foreign house and a garden where my father had never been. Home in England, my mother was careful not to watch Voyage Round My Father when it came on television. I had the chance of writing a longer version to do on the stage at the Greenwich Theatre, which she would also never see. I went with my son, still at school and always passionate for Greece, to Rhodes. We puttered round the island on hired motorbikes and took donkey rides up to Lindos and boat trips to the Turkish coast, and at night I sat in the hotel bedroom and wrote new scenes for the play. Perhaps my mother was right, and I should never have started on the work in progress. The writer's gluttony for material, his habit of eating his life as a caterpillar consumes the leaf it sits on, and spinning it out, changed and perhaps unrecognizable, may not only be an embarrassment to his immediate family. Writing down events is the writer's great protection, his defence and his safety valve. Anger and misery, defeat, humiliation and self-disgust can be changed and used to provide a sense of achievement as he fills his pages. And yet the catharsis is often too complete. The life he has led vanishes into his work and leaves him empty. After months of writing dialogue for my father, I became confused, unable to distinguish between what he had said and what I had invented for him to say. Gradually he left me and became a character in a play. In giving him to other people, I came after a time to lose him for myself. I don't think that this means that I should have done as my mother wanted and not written the play. The process is one of the many disadvantages of the writer's life, like the constant guilt at not working. It is perhaps what makes writers less interesting to talk to than many other professionals. Their lives are no longer there to be discovered privately. They have been thrown open to the public. The play was to open in Greenwich on the 27th of November. A set had been designed consisting of large mechanical cubes which would move about the stage, suggesting a change of place, and could be opened to disgorge properties. By some happy chance, the machinery in these devices, like most stage machinery, failed to work on the opening night, and the audience was able to concentrate on the play without the distraction of menacing geometric shapes dancing the Merry Widow Waltz. Mark Dignam, who played the part of my father so well on television, was to do it on the stage, and we had the same director, Claude Wattham. All that November we were working in the cold and fog of a South London rehearsal room, in search of those far distant moments of breakfast when my father had cursed cold plates and runny eggs, and expounded Darwin's theory, and sung Pretty Little Polly Perkins of Paddington Green. A neighbour, walking along the common, kept an eye on my mother's house. Once she didn't answer to a ring, and the police were sent for. They drove out through the snow, climbed a ladder, and peered through her bedroom window to see her sitting up in bed reading Italian short stories. Usually quiet and courteous, she rebuked them severely. One evening in that November, however, my mother was trying, as she had so often done with my father, to finish the crossword. Her blood pressure had been high in her last years, and she had a stroke and fell onto the carpet in front of the dying logs of her modest and economical fire. When I saw her in hospital, my mother smiled. She seemed distressed, but with her immense courage, amused at her helplessness. We held hands, but as had been so often with us, she couldn't speak. As I say, the play was to open on the 27th of November. On the 26th we worked all night. The lighting was difficult, the stage machinery didn't work, the overworked Greenwich technicians were exhausted, and no one had any particular faith in a play that had no story and was more about blindness than sex. The next day, part of my life, which had been, and perhaps should have stayed, my own private and particular concern, was to be revealed. I sat in the deserted stalls of the theatre, watching an endless lighting rehearsal, drinking cooling instant coffee, and became filled with gloom and apprehension. Far away from the theatre she wouldn't visit, in a small country hospital, my mother died without regaining her speech. The next night her part was taken by an actress. Life seems to have been full of verdicts. The editors of Oz magazine were sent to prison one weekend for publishing their school kids' number. A few days later an appeal judge set them free. In the end their convictions were set aside. Alec Guinness played Voyage Round My Father at the Haymarket. On all these occasions I walked law court corridors waiting for verdicts, or stood on Paddington Station to buy the papers and read the notices, with a dry mouth and a certainty of disaster. For that year, the year I sat in court and discussed the love life of Rupert Bear, the year my mother and father, gone from me as the characters in plays leave and take on another and more remote existence, were acted in the West End, disasters were temporarily postponed. There would be other verdicts, other opening nights, and other closing speeches. There's always a time for failure. I walked into my parents' house and felt that I didn't own it, that I had no right to move the books or rearrange the furniture. We lit a fire and the chimney smoked. We opened cupboards and drawers, feeling like intruders. I went into the winter garden and thought of how it might be put back in time to the day when I planted a tree and met Penelope, to when Henry Winter came to stay, to when I sat beside my father's hammock and he swung himself gently as I read him the Sherlock Holmes stories which he already knew by heart. So much of the garden had vanished into the icy and tangled undergrowth that I didn't know how it could be managed. That is how it was, a part of life seen from one point of view. Much more happened that I cannot tell or remember. To others it would be, I'm quite sure, a different story. I have written all I can write about it now, and these are the things that stayed with me for a while, before they left to go into this book.